Good morning from the west of Ireland. It's a beautiful sunny day here and I'm looking forward to getting out and having a stroll a little bit later. But first of all, I'm going to show you a superb game played in round 3 of Norway chess. Aryan Tari, 21 years old, the latest Norwegian hope against the world champion Magnus Carlsen. So a bit of national rivalry here. You know, the young player coming up and he wants to have a crack at Magnus. Let's see what happened. Aryan Tari with the white pieces. E4 and Magnus wants to unbalance the position. No e4, e5. So he selects Sicilian. Now, is he going to go for the Sveshnikov variation? He could play e5 here, but no. Play something different. The classical variation. So white has a choice here, big choice. Bishop c4, bishop e2. But Tari goes for bishop g5, the so-called Richter-Rauser variation. Has a good reputation for white. You don't go all out, but it's good, solid development for white. And you castle queenside. So automatically we've got an interesting fight on our hands. This is a really well-known variation, and Carlsen plays, well, really this is the old main line. Some of you might recall this exact position from the Fischer-Spassky Reykjavik 1972 match, where, well, Fischer played bishop d3 here, and that was a really tense struggle that ended in a draw. Tari played king b1, which is absolutely standard, of course. You tuck the king away behind those 3 pawns. And this is already, we can see the big difference between the white position and the black position. White's king behind those 3 pawns should be very safe. Whereas black has to decide, where does that king go? Does it go on the king side? Does it go on the queen side? Does it stay in the middle? It's not completely secure wherever it goes. So that is black's big problem in this variation. But black does have 2 bishops. Queen b6. The queen claims a very important diagonal. f5. And Tari follows the time-honoured strategy in these positions. You play f5 and it's all about weakening or putting pressure on that pawn on e6. We'll look at that in a second. Now, Carlsen decides to castle queenside. Now, my database shows there are 388 games that started from this exact position. So it's not as though strategy is kind of unknown here for both players. But, I mean, it's such a double-edged position. Black has the 2 bishops, potential long-term advantage. Black's pawn structure is to some extent compromised by those double pawns. But that pawn mass can sometimes be very beneficial for black if you can advance and let those bishops fly. Really interesting position. Bishop d3, king b8. So Magnus tries to bring his king a little bit away from the center. Knight e2. Now this is the absolutely standard maneuver in this position. The knight heads for f4 and you can see the pressure is building on that pawn on e6. Now the dream position for white here is if black advances that pawn and then the knight sinks itself on d5. This is just a wonderful position for white. So basically black has to, for the moment anyway, maintain that pawn on e6, and white is going to try and put just as much pressure as possible on that pawn to try and force it to either take on f5 or advance to e5. But there is, of course, a disadvantage to playing f5 in that black has the use of the e5 square. So you give something, you get something. Knight e5 played by Carlsen. There we are. The knight ends up on this really nice square. And Tari thought for about 20 minutes here and played actually a pretty standard kind of move. He dropped the bishop back to e2. So why has he done that? Well, it's about giving access to d4. So having dropped the bishop back, now he can play the knight into d4 to put even more pressure on that pawn on e6. And here is a very interesting moment in the game. So if white is going to apply all that pressure on the e6 pawn, then you'd think it might be logical to, for example, play the rook here and drop the bishop back to f8, and that bishop could bounce out to h6. Let's just have a little look at and see what might happen there. So if rook e8, then white could exchange and then play knight d4. The bishop drops back to f8. So that pawn is held, but then after knight h5, you can see there's very uncomfortable pressure here on the pawn. Perhaps rook f1 could be a nice follow-up. Black is very passive in that position. Passive is something that Carlsen does not like. You could also play knight c4. That's an interesting move. That's quite possible, but that could be exchanged off. And then, for example, queen c3, and white has quite a lot of control in that position. So what did Carlsen do? Well, as I said, he doesn't like to fall into passive position, so he struck out with d5 after, well, a similar length think. He thought for almost 20 minutes here. d5 really raises the stakes. It's a very ambitious move, but Carlsen realised that if he falls into a passive position, he could be in trouble. It's not his style at all. So pawn takes pawn. Now, you don't want to recapture on d5 because then knight takes d5. But e takes f5. That's Carlsen's idea. So this curious situation with tripled pawns, but they do control a lot of squares, and that knight on e5 is also in a very nice position. Also, having played d5, then this bishop can now emerge on this diagonal. But it's a tricky position. Black's pawns, really are a bit of a mess here. If white can break through to those, then he's doing well. Knight d4, and that's a good start from Tari. The knight is superbly placed on d4, looking at the c6 square, looking at the f5 pawn. Bishop c5, the bishop comes out. Rook f1, so pressure building on that f pawn. Rook e8, the rook comes into the middle. So Carlsen at least is well coordinated. His pieces do look good. a3, well, that potentially gives the king an escape square, controls b4. You never know, he might want to play b4 himself. King a8. I understand why Carlsen did that, because if it means this knight can now move potentially, and there's no knight c6 check. h3 played by Tari, so that takes away the g4 square. That could be useful. Sometimes that knight may bounce into e3, and it's not exactly clear what Carlsen is doing here. Bishop d7 played by Carlsen, and this is a crunch moment in the game. Perhaps you'd like to have a think. What would you play here if you had the white pieces? There's a very strong move here. Tari played knight h5 here, and that was a mistake, as we're going to see. He should have played pawn to d6. That's a fascinating move. Really instructive, this move. Well, one thing is it opens up this diagonal. That could be very important. So there are more tactics against the king. And in certain variations, that really pays off. But the crucial thing is that now the d5 square is clear for that knight. This is really the story of this entire variation. Can those knights enter on the crucial d5 and f5 squares? So let's just have a quick look. What happens if, for example, queen takes d6? Queen c3, it's a really subtle move. Opens up the d file. So obviously there are now discovered attacks available. And if the queen goes to b6, then knight d5, and that knight comes in, threatens the queen, attacks the pawn on f6, opens up the f file as well. Basically, this is just a superb position for white. I mean, black does have alternatives here, but nothing really satisfactory. There's a rotten endgame that black can go for. I mean, this is obviously better for white with these pawns here. Although, I mean, black's minor pieces are pretty good, but that's a tough one to defend for black. What else have we got? There's bishop c8. What about this one? Looking at the pawn here. But actually, the tactics work in white's favour. Knight takes pawn, and then knight d5, followed by rook takes f5, and white is getting somewhere. Now, it's still really complicated after d6, but there's no doubt that that is the move to play. Let's go back and see what Tari did. Instead, he played knight h5. And Carlsen seizes the moment. Knight c4. That has to be taken because the queen is attacked, and knight e3 coming as well. So bishop takes, pawn takes, and now you can see the b file is opened up. Bishop takes a3, already threatened. And this is nasty for white. Queen c3 defends the pawn on a3, and rook b8. Now white's queen is tied to the defense of that b2 pawn. But this is trouble for white. There is no really good move here. For example, if knight takes f5, we can take and rook e3, and black is breaking through on the queen side. Tari played rook f3. But this allows a beautiful tactical shot. So here we go. What did Carlsen play next? Rook e1. What a fantastic move. Obviously overlooked by Tari. So it can't be taken by the queen because of queen takes b2 mate. So rook takes rook, bishop takes. And black is breaking through here. Queen b4. Of course, the queen drops back to uncover the rook's attack on the queen and through to b2. d6, okay, the queen moves up, and queen a5. And now black has a choice of how to capture on b2. In fact, rook takes b2 check is probably even better than the game continuation, but Carlsen selected bishop takes b2, which is also very powerful. In fact, this is a winning position for black. King a2 steps out of the line of the rook, but now simple move by Carlsen, bishop e5, threatening a huge check on b2 with the rook. So rook b1 is more or less forced. Rook takes b1, king takes b1, and now queen takes d6. A very simple move. And basically black's threats here are overwhelming. There is simply no defense, no decent defense that white has. Queen d1 is the obvious one, followed by a mate on a1. Look at that knight. That's the move that Tari would obviously be regretting. That knight is completely stuck at the edge of the board. And in fact, it's loose as well. It's not even protected by anything. So in many variations, tactically, it's a problem as well. So king c1 played by Tari to prevent queen d1 check. But now queen d4. And basically, the attack is continuing. Both these moves are a massive problem. Queen a1 check and queen g1 check. And there is really no defense. Queen takes a6 at the other end of the board, but actually the queen can't do anything on its own, and dare I say it, black's major pieces are split and the knight again is split. So these are kind of disparate forces against beautiful centralization from Carlsen's pieces, the queen and two bishops working wonderfully together. So no more sensible checks for white. And there is no really good defense here. For example, if the knight comes back into play, that can be taken and white's king is exposed and the check picks up the loose rook. C3 played to stop queen a1 check at least. But now the queen breaks through. Queen g1 check, king d2, queen takes g2. The king has to protect the rook. And now f4 check is a very neat winning move. If king e4, then queen e2 picks up the rook. So knight takes f4. Bishop takes f4 check. And now we've got lots of wonderful checkmates here. It reminds me of some of the problems that I've been setting on Fridays, actually. King takes f4, for example, allows this checkmate, queen e5. So rook takes f4 instead. Queen g3. If king e4, then queen d3 is mate. Rook f3 played. Queen e1 check. If king f4, then queen e5 is mate. So the king has to stagger up the board. But now you can see that the rook on f3 drops. And Carlsen is left a piece up. King d6 and now bishop c8 was actually the final move of the game. Basically, the checks are going to run out very quickly. For example, here, Tari resigned. So if queen b6 check, then queen b7, no more sensible checks. And obviously, the endgame is completely lost with black's extra bishop. Well, what a fascinating game. Carlsen admitted afterwards that he was gambling in playing this variation. It is a bit dubious, but it does offer really interesting counterattacking chances. I've actually played this system for black throughout my career, and I've had some nice wins where similar kind of things happen. You break out and those bishops look wonderful. But I must admit, I've also had the odd disaster where white manages to gain control. And those knights can be very dangerous. But, well, the gamble paid off. So there'll be more coming to you. I'm having a little bit of a break at the moment, but as you can see, different backdrop. I'm in Ireland, but I will be following up and giving you more reports from Norway Chess coming soon. Thanks for watching.